Now, let's go to the first point that is scheduled. Cuhel Annual Memorial Lecture. We decided to have always, as a part of the conference, annual lectures commemorating towering figures, towering intellectuals whose name was tied to Prague. The first one of this tradition is Franz Cuhel, or František Cuhel, who became an author and originator of a crucial idea that then made it into the mainstream of economic thought. However, if you study economics here, you can never ever hear the name of Franz Cuhel. As I was reading Ludwig von Mises's works, such as Socialism or Human Action, or as I read Murray Rothbard's pieces on the history of economic thought, the name of Cuhel kept reappearing there. However, when I asked my professors here at the Prague School of Economics, nobody knew anything about him. So then I learned that Cuhel wrote his book at the beginning of the 20th century called On the Theory of Needs in German. And then I saw, I thought, I might go and improve my German by reading this crucial book in the history of economic thought. So then I went to the library here, the National Library, and asked for Cuhel's work. Well, they had 30 copies of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, but not a single copy of Franz Cuhel's seminal work on the theory of needs. So then I had to send an email to a friend of mine at the University of Chicago to ask him whether Cuhel's work cannot be found there. Well, as probably any other book, University of Chicago Library had a copy. Then we made, I guess, an illegal copy of the book and then imported it to the Czech Republic. And that was the first copy, well, I don't know whether ever or only in the last half a century here in Prague. It's kind of sad situation when everybody in the world knows names of Czech hockey players, for example. But, to ask a question of anybody, both here and outside of the country, to give us a few names of famous Czech economists, well, at best you will get a name of our current president, Václav Klaus, who wanted to save the Austrian school. However, I believe he did not really succeed. Well, I guess we will do a better job anyway. Now, without bothering you anymore with my personal Cuhel stories, let me now invite here my friend and colleague, Dr. Jörg Guido Hülsmann, who was awarded Franz Cuhel Memorial Prize in Economic Education, and will give us a lecture on Franz Cuhel legacy. So please welcome Guido Hülsmann. And that is a wonderful prize that will be with Guido till the end of his life, I guess. So Guido, thank you very much.
Can I give you your notes? So thank you very much, Josef, for this very charming introduction. You really managed to surprise me.
Sorry.
Yes?
One technical little thing.
Yes?
You'll be
Taped.
You'll be taped.
Oh, so I cannot make any jokes about our government. Okay. So probably the other way around. Like this?
To the pocket.
Okay.
And now we can start.
All right. I won't repeat everything that I said, my many words. You really managed to surprise me, so I never expected that I would be honored for excellence in economic education, but so be it. I will come later with a few words on a plausible justification for this, but in any case, thank you very much. I'm very proud and honored to be with you this afternoon as your Cuhel lecturer. It is, by the way, only thanks to my Czech colleagues that I learned how to pronounce the name of Cuhel correctly. Before, when I first came across Cuhel about 12 or 13 years ago, I always said Cuhel. Also, sounded weird because Kuh in German is a cow, and then Cuhel, okay. But in any case, he was a brilliant theoretician, and I'm certainly honored to deliver the Cuhel lecture this year. In preparation of my lecture, I did some last-minute research because one of the important aspects of this lecture is that it takes place in Prague, and we have this wonderful conference here organized by Josef Schima and Shimo Bilo. And so I was wondering how firmly, this was certainly an illustration of how firmly Austrian thought is still established in Prague. And then I looked at the telephone book in order to get a glimpse of how many Cuhels have survived and how many Wiesers. I was quite happy to see that there was no more Wieser around. Sorry, Sam. But unfortunately, there's no more Cuhel around either. Yeah. But certainly our friends from the Liberalny Institute and from the Economic University here are firmly established. So I found 167 Shimas. Okay. 7 of which are Josefs. And I found, that's another friend of mine, I found 167 Havels, of which 23 are Youngs. Okay, so I'm quite glad that we got this very nice handbook in preparation of the conference. I would never have been able to call my friends. Just look at the telephone book and you have the choice between 23. Yeah, but then you might wonder, so we have 13 Mengers. So that was a very encouraging sign. So genetically, Prague seems to be predisposed to host a conference on Austrian economics. And more than that, there have been 117 Böhms. Okay, so Böhms, of course, is a German word for somebody who comes from Bohemia. He's a Böhm. So it's not surprising that there were 117 Böhms. And Eugen von Böhm-Barwerk, we call him Eugen von Böhm-Barwerk, but the correct name was Eugen Böhm, Ritter von Böhm-Barwerk. So Eugen Böhm, that was the family name, and then Knight of Barwerk. So that was nobility title. So Böhm-Barwerk and Menger are still with us. And with this, we have already the direction of the general orientation in which this conference takes place. It's the orientation of the mainstream of Austrian economists that is defined by the lineage of Menger, Böhm-Barwerk, Mises, Rothbard, which is distinctly different from the sideline. Sometimes Professor Hoppe calls it the sideline, which is defined by the line Wieser, Hayek, Kürzner. So what's the point of the main line? Well, the main line is distinct by its realism, right? The analytical realism. So the main line tries to do, without fiction in economic analysis, tries to coin concepts and explanations that refer in all elements to observable or otherwise apprehensible facts of real human life. And the result of this is praxeology, as Professor Schwarz has remarked before. So that's the scientific discipline that characterizes Austrian economics. Praxeology, so the logic of human action. We have here social laws that we can apprehend a prioristically, that is, without having need to verify or refute them by reference to observable things. We verify or refute them by reference to the things that we know about human action. So, for example, that there are things like choice and means used to attain ends, and so on. And so in order, I was thinking what kind of lecture I could give to do honor to Franz Cuhel, who is famous for his contributions to value theory. And it wasn't actually too difficult for me to come up with an appropriate subject. So it had to do something with value theory, which has been neglected in Austrian thought. And one area where value theory needs development is in the analysis of the interrelationships between value and property, or more precisely between value and the ways we appropriate things, so the laws of appropriation. And one aspect that can be, or one economic phenomenon that can be very well explained or analyzed from this point of view is the phenomenon of moral hazard. Okay, so what I will outline now is a theory of moral hazard, or political economy of moral hazard, from an Austrian point of view. According to the standard definition, moral hazard is present in actions by economic agents to the detriment of others in situations where they do not bear the full consequences of their actions. Okay? So moral hazard in a general sense is the disposition of a person A to use more resources than he otherwise would have used because he knows or believes to know that someone else, B, will provide some or all of these resources. Now this might be perfectly innocent, and if I have an uncle in the United States who is very rich, and I expect to be a millionaire next year, well, then I can start spending some money now, right? So I live over my means. I go to the Bahamas and drive finally the Mercedes-Benz and all these nice things. And then eventually the uncle dies, and I, in fact, inherit, so that's not a big deal. That's a nice problem. There are many other areas where we are living over our means, where we're using the property of other people, we're even hurting other people, without having to say that this is necessarily a problem. Right? Such cases are especially widespread in sports. For example, the introduction of mandatory helmets in professional ice hockey has created an incentive for players to engage in more violent attacks without fearing pain and skull fracture. As a result, the sport has become more violent and was a moral hazard, so to say, for the players. They have become more violent, but it has not produced an invasion of other people's property. Nobody is forced to play the American NHL, and those who do play there know what they're heading for. Actually, there might be more than a few players who very much enjoy the greater violence that is only possible with helmets. The same thing holds true, of course, for mandatory helmets and shoulder pads in football, mandatory gloves in professional boxing, and a good number of other cases. A problem appears only if a person A has the possibility to use B's resources, and this against the will of B. So here we have moral hazard in a narrow sense. So A has an incentive, so to say, to steal from B. He has an incentive to behave irresponsibly. We could even say that he has an incentive to exploit B. An exploitation of this sort is widely perceived as a market failure. One of the reasons is that A, obviously in such cases, spends at least part of his time expropriating B and using B's property rather than producing something on his own. So there's in general terms, what we have here is overconsumption and underproduction. Now, the dominant theory of the causes of moral hazard has emerged in the 1970s. This theory explains moral hazard as a consequence of the fact that market participants are unequally well informed about economic reality. In other words, moral hazard results from asymmetries of information. And the theory of moral hazard is therefore part of the economics of information. Now, it has been one of my hobbies to criticize the economics of information, which is fairly widespread among Austrian economists, especially in the Hayekian branch. Right? So the phenomenon of information and transmission of information plays a big role. And, of course, although it does play a significant role in the economy and in human action in general, I found that its role has been exaggerated. So one of my hobbies, as I said, has been to set the record straight and to explain that information is really a secondary phenomenon. It's an epiphenomenon. and that the root of the problems that of the problems that we ascribe to lacks of information or lacking transmission of information is often, at least in some important cases, to be ascribed to bad ways of appropriating resources. So it's a property economics problem. So in my lecture, I will criticize this dominant information theory and propose an alternative approach. I will argue that information asymmetries are just one among several causes of moral hazard, and that information asymmetries entail the exploitation of third parties only accidentally and ephemerally. By contrast, moral hazard also results from government interventionism, and only in this case it necessarily and permanently creates exploitation. Most importantly, moral hazard results from government interventionism even in the absence of informational asymmetries. The theory of moral hazard, rightly conceived, is therefore not a part of information economics, but of the discipline that analyzes how the acquisition of property determines human behavior. It is a part of property economics, or in other words, of political economy. Okay, so I will first present the conventional informational theory of the causes and consequences of moral hazard, and then I'll switch over to the political economy of moral hazard by first analyzing how moral hazard works out in a free market, and then how it works out under government interventionism. So the conventional theory of moral hazard stresses that people act on the basis of different knowledge about the real world. This will hardly be contested by anybody. The baker knows other things than the astronaut. The opera singer knows other things than the teacher of mathematics. Neither can it be doubted that people are unequally well informed about the real world. Some bakers know more about cake making and the cake market than others, and so on. In short, informational asymmetries certainly do exist, and they are a universal aspect of human life as we know it. However, they do not all by themselves entail the disposition that we call moral hazard. They do not per se incite human beings to behave irresponsibly. It is therefore that the dominant theory of moral hazard stresses an additional criterion to explain the emergence of moral hazard, namely the separation of ownership and control. So we not only need an asymmetry of information, we also need to have a separation of ownership and control. And two main cases can be distinguished here, the case of co-ownership and the case of agency contracts. In the case of co-ownership, any one owner has control over a given piece of property, but not exclusive control. Informational asymmetries can then produce moral hazard in conjunction with this separation of ownership and control. Whenever one co-owner of a swimming pool cannot effectively monitor the activities of his fellow owners, the latter have an incentive to swim without cleaning up, without repairing the fences, and so on, thus increasing their own monetary and psychic revenue at their expense. Similarly, in the case of an agency contract, moral hazard can arise when an economic good is not effectively controlled by its owner, who is called the principal, but by a different person who is called an agent, for example, by an employee. Again, informational asymmetries produce moral hazard in conjunction with the separation of ownership and control. The agent, who is fully informed about his own activities, has an incentive to act in his own material interest against the material interests of his less informed principal. Whenever the principal cannot effectively monitor the activities of his agents, therefore, the latter has an incentive to increase his own income at the expense of the former. The standard case of moral hazard in an agency setting is an insurance contract. Here, the insurance is the less informed principal, and the insured person is the agent. Automobile insurance, for example, creates a moral hazard for drivers. It creates an additional incentive for risky driving because other people, namely other clients of the insurance company, will pay a part of the costs of the accidents. Same thing holds true for unemployment insurance or for health insurance. However, moral hazard is in no way a particular problem of the insurance industry. It can arise in almost any other field of human activity where there is a separation of ownership and control. Employees can be subject to moral hazard to the extent that they reduce their efforts without fearing reduced pay. Debtors may be subject to moral hazard if they believe they can squander the money without negative consequences when they turn out to be incapable of paying back. Auditing firms may be subject to moral hazard when they sell consulting services to the very companies they're supposed to audit. A central bank can produce moral hazard in the banking community, for example, if the commercial bankers perceive the central bank as a lender of last resort. Taxpayers are said to be the subject of moral hazard if they can evade high tax regions and so on. And in the literature of public choice and constitutional political economy, governments and parliaments are often portrayed as agents prone to moral hazard, whereas the voters are the less informed principals. Now, it is a rather significant fact that in the light of the now dominant theory, information asymmetries produce moral hazard only in conjunction with the separation of ownership and control. I will argue that the latter is indeed the decisive element, whereas information asymmetries are but a sideshow. I will argue that moral hazard systematically entails exploitation only when ownership and control of a resource are separated in a special way, namely without the consent of the owner. So I will first now analyze the voluntary separation of ownership and control as it occurs in the free market, and then turn to the most important case of involuntary separation, namely the case of interventionism. When we speak of a voluntary separation between ownership and control, we mean that each property owner has the unhampered right to use his property as he sees fit. This includes, of course, the right to let other people use his property under conditions that he approves, as well as the right to co-own property with other people. So we're considering now the working properties of a free market. The question we have to answer is whether a voluntary separation of ownership and control does per se produce any negative consequences due to information asymmetries. In other words, we have to examine whether the conjunction of these two conditions is sufficient for one man to enrich himself at the expense of another man, or whether, to the contrary, even in the presence of the combined two conditions, such exploitation of man by man is a contingent consequence. I will argue that moral hazard does not necessarily entail exploitation, that whenever moral hazard results from them accidentally from these informational asymmetries, there are strong forces at work to eliminate exploitation, and that moral hazard-induced exploitation is therefore only accidental, but also ephemeral, on the free market. The decisive fact on which we can base our argument is that the problem of information asymmetries and separation of ownership and control finds on the free market an effective antidote in the fact of free will and of expectations. Consider the problem of principal-agent of a principal-agent relationship. Suppose the owner of a grocery shop hires a clerk. He hires him for a salary of 1,000 euros per month. Suppose further that the owner has various other shops so that he cannot supervise the agent all the time. So, according to conventional theory, the clerk is likely to behave differently than he would in the permanent presence of his employer. He can have longer naps over the lunch break, can be very nasty in dealing with clients, or at least more nasty in dealing with the customers, and so on. Now, all of this we can admit right away. But the crucial question is, does the sloppy clerk necessarily enrich himself at the expense of his employer? Does the principal necessarily bear costs entailed by the unfaithful agent? Only if this were the case could we speak of exploitation. But it is not the case. The clerk does not necessarily enrich himself at the expense of the owner because the latter can anticipate his behavior. To the extent that the employer anticipates the behavior of his agent, of his clerk, the payment of 1,000 euros would properly reflect the discounted marginal value product of sloppy labor. And this is, of course, precisely what prudent employers do on a free market whenever they hire new people. They discount the marginal value product of good or normal work by a factor that represents the risk of bad work due to lack of supervision. The role of anticipations can hardly be overstated in the theory of moral hazard. To the extent that the expectations of the principal are correct, moral hazard on the part of the agent cannot lead to a situation in which the latter exploits the former. But there's more. Principals acting on a free market do not merely have to rely on their foresight of the future actions of their agents. They are also free to design contractual relationships in ways that minimize, first of all, the danger of moral hazard arising in the first place, and second, the danger of moral hazard, once there, affecting them negatively. The insurance industry offers well-known illustrations. In health insurance, for example, we have exclusions, deductibles, and co-pays. These are tools intended to reduce moral hazard. And similarly, moral hazard in road traffic has been effectively reduced with the help of radar controls and black boxes in vehicles. Most importantly, on a free market, principals have the liberty to sever contractual relations with agents anytime. The threat of being fired is probably the most powerful incentive to deliver diligent work rather than succumb to moral hazard. The same effect results from reputation effects and blacklists. Analogous considerations apply to all forms of co-ownership. Here, the various co-owners, being aware that the utilization of the common resource must be restricted to preserve its value, have an incentive to set up and accept rules for its use. If the number of co-owners is high, then there is a market niche, there is a profit opportunity, and individual capitalist entrepreneurs might step in and provide the co-property and the rules. An example is, for example, housing covenants. Now, before turning to the analysis, so that's the analysis of moral hazard on a free market, but before coming to interventionism, it might be useful very briefly to consider an intermediate or a hybrid form, a hybrid setting. That is the setting in which property rights are not clearly defined. And this case is not only interesting from a systematic point of view, but also because in practice a great number of cases are such that property rights are not perfectly defined. This concerns in particular rights in air and in oceans, and rights in the property rights in those beings that inhabit oceans and air, namely birds, fish, and so on. Human beings exploit these resources with only feeble attempts at creating something like property rights. Thus, in practice, we have a system of co-ownership without rules. Not surprisingly, the result is universal moral hazard. Everybody has an incentive to use the resource in question as much as possible. This is a sure recipe, of course, for quick depletion, as has been known at least from the times of Aristotle. In more recent years, this phenomenon has been called the tragedy of the commons. Now, in this practically highly important case, and therefore I deal with it, it's interesting from a theoretical point of view, we notice that information asymmetries play no role whatsoever. Moral hazard would be at work here, even if each co-owner were perfectly aware of the activities of his fellow owners. We could even say that moral hazard would be here at work, especially in the case in which every co-owner was perfectly aware of the activities of his fellow owners. Now, important though moral hazard stemming from a deficient or lacking definition of property rights might be in practice, it is no match for moral hazard that results from a forced separation of ownership and control. To this type of moral hazard I now turn. By a forced separation of ownership and control, I mean a separation brought about against the will of the owner. Although owners might be forced both by governments and by private parties, government interventionism is far more important in practice, not only because it is much more frequent, but also because it is usually, at least in our Western societies, enshrined in law, and therefore it can be anticipated. Let us first stress that government interventionism must not be confused with a mixed economy. In the latter, the government is one of several owners, and it controls only its own property. By contrast, an interventionist government commands other property owners to use their resources in a different way than these owners themselves would have used them. And in so doing, the interventionist government makes some person or group A, for example itself, the uninvited co-owner of other people's B property. The essence of interventionism is precisely this. It's institutionalized, uninvited co-ownership. Government makes itself the uninvited and unwanted co-owner whenever it taxes, regulates, and prohibits. The specific forms of taxation, regulation, and prohibition are myriad. The important fact for us now is that any form of government interventionism, by its very nature, entails a forced separation of ownership and control. Taxation means that the government proclaims itself the owner of a certain share of resources belonging to its subjects, and that it forces them to eventually hand over these resources, which the latter would not have yielded voluntarily. Today, taxation does not concern concrete physical items, but their monetary equivalent. It follows that, until the tax is paid, the government imposes itself as the co-owner of virtually all physical assets of the taxpayer. However, until the tax is paid, the resources in question are typically controlled by the citizen. Regulation means that the government prescribes a certain use of certain resources. This use is typically not the one that the citizens would have chosen. Again, the government thereby proclaims itself the co-owner of these resources. Consider the case of price controls. If the government fixes a minimum wage rate, it effectively proclaims itself the co-owner of workers because it does not allow them to work under conditions they see fit, and it also proclaims itself the co-owner of the capitalists, or more precisely, of the money of the capitalists, to the extent that it wants to determine how much the latter spend on labor. However, the government does not permanently control the actions of the workers, and it does not interfere with other uses of the capitalists' money. Similarly, prohibition means that the government outlaws a certain use of certain resources altogether. Again, it thereby proclaims itself the co-owner of all these resources that could, after all, be put to the prohibited use. For example, if it prohibits the production and sale of alcoholic beverages, it effectively imposes itself as a co-owner of all resources that could be used for the production and sale of such drinks. However, it does not interfere when those resources are used in other employments. Hence, in all cases, the government interventionism entails a forced separation of ownership and control. It follows that, by its very nature, it creates a moral hazard both for the citizens and for the government. Most importantly, it creates a situation in which each of the parties involved, the citizens on the one hand and the government on the other hand, desires to exploit the resources subject to interventionism at the expense of the other parties. First, consider the reaction of the citizens to taxation, regulation, and prohibition. From the very fact that interventionism entails forced co-ownership, it follows that the citizens have an incentive to evade the intervention. They can, to some extent, evade it because they have still some control over their property. To avoid taxation, for example, they can choose to invest capital in a country with low taxes rather than in a country with high taxes. They can choose a profession that is less taxed than other professions, and they can choose to make fraudulent declarations of their income and capital. To evade regulations, they can choose not to buy or sell commodities that are subject to price controls, or they can choose to buy and sell them on the black market. To evade prohibitions, they can buy and sell prohibited items on the black market. Now, operating on the black market is risky and thus very costly, and evasion to other countries is costly too. Thus, it follows that there is an incentive for the citizens to use a greater part of their property for personal consumption rather than invest it. Hence, the general tendency of interventionism on the citizens is to entail excessive consumption and to make production more costly because of the necessity to evade the intervention. But moral hazard also comes into play on the side of the government itself. Governments rely on the resource use that comes through taxation and regulation. They will therefore tend to tax more and regulate more in order to neutralize the ways in which the citizens evaded its previous interventionism. It will seek to close the loopholes. That's the current expression. We're closing the loopholes. First we tax people, and then if they export their capital, they behave nastily. So we need to close this loophole. So we have here a basic mechanism of the dynamics of government interventionism. Interventionist governments have an incentive to extend taxation to all branches of economic life, to regulate industries that so far have escaped regulation, and also to beat into submission the countries that serve as tax havens. The ultimate result is to reinforce the tendencies that we characterized above: excessive consumption and lacking production. In short, a general impoverishment of society. It can hardly be overemphasized that it is not co-ownership per se that causes these excesses. And as we have seen in the analysis of co-ownership on the free market, there we might have moral hazard, but we can escape it through anticipation, expectation on the one hand, and through appropriate contractual devices on the other hand. But in the case of government interventionism, the excesses that we mentioned are caused by the uninvited and unwanted co-ownership that springs from interventionism. Moreover, we notice that in our analysis, that this analysis in no way depends on the existence of asymmetrical information. We can assume, for the sake of argument, that all citizens are perfectly aware of what the government is doing. We can assume, for the sake of argument, that the government knows perfectly what the citizens are doing. Right, so no asymmetry of information at all. Of course, that's not realistic, but even in this fictional case, nothing would change to our picture. Government interventionism entails moral hazard both on the side of the government and on the side of the citizen. And this moral hazard cannot be neutralized by choosing appropriate contractual devices because it has no contractual basis at all, but is imposed. It cannot be sidestepped by choosing to avoid the moral hazard-prone situation altogether. Right? If we have a free market, we can just, if we know certain arrangements having a common pool that creates moral hazard, well, we can just choose not to buy into property where there's a common pool. We're free to do this. Nobody obliges us to buy an apartment in a house, tenement house. But here, when we have government interventionism, we cannot just sidestep it because the situation itself is imposed. We're not free to choose. The very meaning of interventionism is, as we have said, to overrule the choice of property owners. And similarly, the workings of moral hazard cannot be eliminated or diminished by correct expectations, as is the case of moral hazard on the free market. The case is exactly the reverse. It is precisely when the citizens anticipate how high the next tax will be and when it will hit them that a moral hazard will start bearing on them and incite them to evade the tax. How many more minutes do I have? 5:10, that's fine. So I can come now very briefly to what I believe is a very important application of moral hazard theory. And the application is fiat money and inflation. So what we have here is monetary interventionism. The fundamental intervention on which all other interventions in this field are built is the imposition of a legal tender money. A legal tender is a means of payment that the market participants are obliged to accept even if they made contracts that stipulated payments in other terms. This intervention creates a moral hazard for the market participants to hoard or export the media of exchange that in their eyes are better than the legal tender, but which they are legally bound to use at par with the legal tender. The paradoxical result, that's a very well-known result, is that only the legal tender, that is the medium of exchange that everybody seeks to avoid, remains in circulation. The attempted evasion of the legal tender produces the opposite result. Economists call this phenomenon Grasim's law. All contemporary paper money systems are based on such legal tender privileges. Paper money does not compete with other monetary products of the free market, but is imposed by special privilege. It is therefore called fiat paper money. This institution is of great interest from the point of view of the theory of moral hazard. In fact, it entails moral hazard on the greatest imaginable scale, both on the side of its producer and on the side of its users. Fiat paper money creates moral hazard for the producer because he has the possibility to create ex nihilo, without production, virtually any amount of money, and thus to buy virtually any amount of goods and services for sale. The only limit to this capacity is the hyperinflation that invariably results in the case of a great inflation of the money supply. The 2004 Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to two economists who analyzed the moral hazard inherent in monetary policy making. They called this condition time inconsistency. Kitland and Prescott, that's the name of these two economists, argued that monetary authorities had an incentive to expand the money supply faster than expected by the market participants, for example, to produce positive employment effects. But to surprise the market participants, they had to build a reputation of not expanding the money supply. But fiat paper money also creates moral hazard on the side of the money users, the citizens, and also the governments, because they sooner or later come to realize that the masters of the printing press have the power to bail out virtually any bankrupt firm or government. And in case they fail to realize this, there are the directors of the central banks that are occasionally there to remind them. Some of you might have followed now in famous speech by one of the directors of the Federal Reserve Board, Ben Bernanke, in November 2003, in which he spelled out in not unclear terms that the Federal Reserve can, if necessary, produce any amount of money, print just any amount of paper money. What's the consequence? So the other market participants will therefore engage in more or less reckless financial planning, expecting that the monetary authorities will not allow a great mass of reckless planners go bankrupt. This speculation has been borne out by the last 30 years. We just need to look at basic statistics. You don't need any regression calculus and so on. Just need to look at the basic figures. And what you see is that public debt has exploded with the money supply. This speculation of reckless plans has therefore been borne out, and public and private debts are at record heights, and this all over the world. Monetary theorists have been aware of this danger early on, even though they did not use the word moral hazard in this context. Here we should mention in the first place all defenders of sound money, that is, of competitive money, such as Mises, Hayek, Rothbard, and many other economists of the Austrian school. But neither has the problem escaped the attention of the champions of fiat money. Thus, for example, Walter Bagehot, who coined the term lender of last resort, warned in 1873 that the central bank, while freely lending in times of financial duress, would have to avoid at any cost the impression that it would bail out the market participants. Well, the only thing we can say is that they have not avoided this very well. And some 60 years later, Herbert Simon, a famous Chicago economist, stressed the need for rules rather than discretion in economic policy, essentially for the same reason. And his disciple, Milton Friedman, reiterated this point in the 1960s, even more famously in his proposal for a constant growth of the money supply. The idea, however, that rules could prevent large-scale moral hazard in a fiat paper money system, I'm sorry to say, defies human logic. It takes many years of study, preferably under the auspices of monetary authorities, to familiarize oneself with this notion. After all, the only possible use of a printing press is to produce more money than would have been produced on a free market. There is no other use. So, in analogy to a felicitous phrase from the philosopher Anthony de Jazet, I might say that praising the virtues of monetary stabilization while maintaining legal tender laws for paper money is like using chastity belts for Miss World while handing over the keys to the lady. Let us add, though, that to draw a perfect analogy with our monetary constitution, we would have to advertise day in, day out, preferably in the New York Times, that Miss World definitely owns the key to her chastity belt. Now, the unavoidable result of such a state of affairs are financial bubbles. If more or less every major market participant in the financial markets is subject to moral hazard, then in due time even the smaller traders realize that the bigger fish play the moral hazard card, and thus they venture to set out on the same path. This means that the market participants sooner or later come to base their plans on the availability of a far greater quantity of goods and services than is really available in the economy. In short, paper money, by virtue of its mere existence, not by virtue of a bad management, by virtue of its mere existence, produces massive error on a large scale until the bubble bursts in a crisis. Again, as in the other cases of interventionism-induced moral hazard, these effects cannot be neutralized, avoided, or diminished through anticipations. And this means that they cannot be managed through the management of expectations. Kittlin and Prescott, along with the rest of the mainstream, have in the past 30 years labored to bring expectations into the picture of monetary policy. The next 30 years, I guess, will presumably be needed to take account of institutionalized moral hazard. The problem is, our monetary system will not survive that long if we can extrapolate the speed of the events of the past 30 years. In conclusion, then, let me stress that information asymmetries do exist, and they have a profound impact on the market, especially in that they prompt the creation of various institutions designed to prevent such information asymmetries from generating moral hazard. However, the emphasis on information asymmetries has been inappropriate on two accounts. First, it has deterred contemporary economists from a careful analysis of other sources of moral hazard, such as interventionism. And second, it has led to the unwarranted view that information asymmetries necessarily produce market failures. So the point of this lecture was to give an example of because we can talk in abstract about the praxeological approach, about the approach that has been developed by Mises and Rothbard and others. The point was to illustrate how this can be applied to a concrete phenomenon on which all economists can agree, phenomenon of moral hazard, and how Austrians might bring in a different perspective on this problem by stressing not information asymmetries or whatever other explanation might be in vogue, but to stress a subject that has been at the forefront of economic analysis in the 19th century and is still upheld today only by Austrian economists, namely the difference between the different appropriation systems, right? Between the free market, in which appropriation takes place with the mutual consent of all property owners, and government interventionism, in which the will of present owners is violated. I know that some of the papers that will be presented tomorrow will follow up in this line, because I've given midwife services to the emergence of some of these papers. It's therefore, again, that I'm very proud and happy to have the occasion to deliver this Cuhel lecture, and see now this conference as a first step on the part of Europeans spreading Austrian economics and promoting further research in Austrian economics. So far, we've been pretty much dependent on the work of the Mises Institute in the United States, and many of the younger participants here have benefited from fellowships of the Mises Institute, in particular of support from people like Don Prince. And now it's time to grow up, to do things on our own, and I'm sure this conference is the first step toward this. Thank you.